All right, good morning everyone. This is David at Cornfed Suspension. I'm the owner and founder of Cornfed. We are going to be working on Kyle's new 24 Tacoma. We're going to be doing a 2.5 front, 1 inch rear on this with the UHMW preload spacers and the top out for a full 2.5 inches of front lift. Just some initial setup. We did some initial layout here. Put the truck on jack stands under the frame to stabilize it. Took the wheels off. Just doing some basic prep. Removed the skid plate in underneath. And one of the first steps we recommend is putting a Sharpie mark vertical on the alignment cams, because we're going to be loosening those as part of the install process, and that Sharpie mark gives you a reference point to come back to for your temporary alignment until you can get the truck into an alignment shop and get the alignment done post install. The next thing we're going to be doing, and just a little bit of clarification here, we're going to be doing a step-by-step through the instructions, so that those of you that are doing the install yourself can basically step-by-step through the instructions and have a good perspective of what each step, each line item on the instructions is going to look like for you. The next thing we're going to do, we're going to take the sway bar loose from the lower control arm, and then right after that, we're going to take the 2 bolts on the bottom of the spindle loose, and that will take the spindle loose from the lower control arm. And then we'll continue on from there. All right, so the next step we're gonna do, we're gonna loosen the steering knuckle loose from the lower control arm. So there's gonna be 2 bolts here at the bottom of the lower ball joint on the front side and the rear. They're going to be a 22 millimeter or 7/8 if you don't have it. I'm going to take those loose, and everything else is still held in place. The next step after that, we're going to go ahead. We've already marked the alignment cam, a vertical mark, so that we have that as a reference point to go back to after the lift is installed. If they've moved around a little bit, that gives a reference for a temporary alignment until you can get the truck into an alignment shop. And then once we've made sure those are marked, we're going to take the front and rear alignment cams loose. Those are a 24 millimeter or 15/16 wrench or socket to take those loose. All right. Oh, come on. This is where I should have left it 1 notch higher. So does the interior of this one have that that light colored, almost cream interior? No, it would not. All right, so the next thing we're going to do is we're going to take the bolt that holds the bottom of the lower shock mount in place. That's a fairly long bolt that goes all the way through here. It's a 22 millimeter. The nut is on the back side of the control arm, so we're going to take the nut all the way loose, and then we're going to push that bolt all the way through, forward and out. At that point, the lower control arm should be loose and either a small amount of pressure or it'll droop slightly out of the way, which will help in our next step, which will be removing the strut from the frame mount. voila. That was easy. All right, and our next step, the lower control arm's down out of the way, so there's nothing holding the bottom of the strut. But we're gonna take these four nuts loose here at the top of the strut, not the center one, the 4 ones on the outside perimeter. Take those loose, make sure you hold on the strut so it doesn't fall out and damage anything. But just take those loose, and we're gonna lower the strut down out of here. Yeah. One quick thing we're going to do here, I made a mark on the outside edge of the strut, marking it out, and made a mark on the coil, and then the top plate, actually it kind of has its own mark, but we can mark it too. That's not critical right now, but it will be important for a step a little bit longer down the line, because you have to line up this bottom bolt hole with the bolt pattern at the top. Otherwise, you're going to have a fit trying to get that back into the frame mount. So, all right. All right, so once I've compressed the spring, we've got some gap here at the bottom, so the majority of the pressure is off of the spring. The strut is loose here. We want to make sure that pressure is held by the spring compressors before we take this nut loose at the top of the strut. And it's going to be tight. Now, all right, so at this point, this rubber isolator bushing that's at the top of the strut top plate, you're going to remove that and it'll come off. And then the preload bushing will slide on here in that same place where the isolator bushing just came off, and then it will be reassembled onto the strut. One other quick note while I'm here, because there's been a lot of confusion on this configuration, Toyota does not have a factory bump stop on the lower control arm like they had in years gone by. There is a bump stop here in the strut upper mount that contacts onto the strut body, and that is the bump stop for the front suspension. A lot of people got confused and thought there was no bump stop at all, but that's integrated into the strut mount, so that is an integral part of this new configuration. All right. All right, now I compressed that down almost ideal. So the next important part, and we had talked briefly about it as we marked the coil and the outer part of here. To line up this lower shock mount, we need to ensure that the top plate orientation and this lower shock mount are correctly in line. Toyota gives us a arrow mark here and this groove that need to be straight in line with this lower bolt hole. Picture 3 on your instructions will show that, and you need to have that lower bolt hole and this arrow and groove on the top plate in line with each other. Otherwise, when you go to mount the strut back in the truck, that's going to be out of line and going to give you difficulty lining that lower bolt hole up. Even with that lined up, you may experience a small amount of misalignment, but small amount of misalignment you can give a little bit of twist or with your hands, or using a punch in the bolt hole to turn it slightly so that you can get the bolt through there. All right, and then our last step before the strut goes back into the frame mount, we're gonna add the gold steel top out shim. It's got a U-shaped mark that goes inward facing the engine. You've got your out mark here, so you're gonna be opposite that. This will only go one way. This U-shape has to go in towards the engine. If you try and mount it any of the other ways, it's not gonna work. So if for some reason that doesn't line up and drop on, recheck your reference marks. And now the strut's ready to go back into the frame mount. All right, and we've got the strut secured back in. Can't even see that gold top out shim up at the top, unless you look real hard and you see the preload spacer there at the top of the strut. And this right here is why you have to line up the strut carefully, because otherwise this won't line up. And it can be challenging enough anyway. All right, so one quick reference. Here in a second, we're gonna be putting the two bolts back in the lower ball joint. One quick note on that, you want to put just a little bit of blue Loctite on those. And as you start those into the spindle, a little bit of pressure down on the upper control arm, and start those carefully by hand to make sure that you don't cross thread those as they start to go into the steering knuckle. The one other reference, and you notice we have jack under the lower control arm, have the weight of the truck on the suspension, and once the weight of the truck is on the suspension, then we tighten up these bushings. One quick note on that, a safety note on that: if you have two floor jacks, we have two jacks, one on each side under the suspension, holding the weight of the truck right now, just barely off of the jack stand so that the weight is on these. If you only have one jack and lift up on just one side, the truck can shift weird on the jack stands. So if you only have one jack, be extremely careful to not shift the truck off of the jack stands and dump it. That would be bad. So torquing these lower ball joint bolts is one of the more critical ones. You're going to torque these down to 130 foot-pounds. Obviously, like we had started, make sure you got some Loctite on there, make sure they're not cross-threaded, and when they're fully seated, torque them until the torque wrench snaps. So you want to make sure that your alignment cam is back to the original Sharpie mark for your reference point, and then tighten that down. I want to tighten it down nice and tight, and then torque it, or a couple of good hefty grunts. No sense getting it overkill tight, because the alignment shop's going to have to take it loose to adjust your alignment. All right, David at Cornfed Suspension back again. We're working on this 24 Tacoma still. We're getting ready to do the rear lift spacers. We've got it on jack stands, got the rear tires off. First thing we're doing here, taking the bottom end of the rear shock loose, and then taking the 2 bolts off of the sway bar, where the sway bar connects to the axle on both sides. That'll allow us to droop the rear suspension, add the spacers on the rear, and then it's nice and simple. Generally, this rear install is gonna take 20 minutes, a fraction of the time it takes to do the front, so. All right, one other thing. There's an ABS wire here that has a 12mm bolt on each side. You want to disconnect that 12mm bolt so that when you droop the axle, you don't accidentally damage that ABS wire. You can do that if you want, or if not, I can button that back on quick here in a minute. All right, and we already have the bolts out of the bottom of the rear shock. Just knock those forward so they can hang loose. We got the sway bar pulled loose from the axle, so that as we droop this axle, it'll be able to lower enough. We'll take the springs out, add the spacer, and it all goes back together super quick. Whoa. Didn't mean to drop it quite that quick, but we're good. Just a little bit more. All right. And the spring is loose. So when the spring comes out, there's a rubber isolator that is up at the top. That stays in place. In this case, I had to pull it down out, but that will stay up there, up at the top. I'll have to hold it back up in as we put the spacer up and in. So the 1-inch rear spacer, that rubber isolator goes back up at the top. And up and in we go. All right, you get the bottom coil wrap seated into its appropriate place down here in the axle. And then before we bring the axle back up, we're gonna make sure this upper mount is seated. But first we gotta go do the same thing on the other side. All right, and while we have just a little bit of pressure here, make sure the bottom of the coil is seated. Make sure the spacer and the rubber isolator are centered up in the top on that side. And over here on this side, and both sides are good. And we can bring the weight of the truck back up onto the rear axle. And at this point, we can bring this up to basically the point where the bottom of the rear shocks connects back up, and they can go back into place. And the rest of it just goes together from here. Once the rear shocks are seated back onto their boss, run the bolts in and snug those down, and we'll reconnect the sway bar and its mounts, and reconnect this ABS line and its wire, and its 12 millimeter bolt. And it'll be almost time to put some wheels back on it. I'm getting kind of hot and sweaty now. Thank you. Reattach this ABS wire up here. Run its 12 mil back in. And almost there.